Frustrated. I'm a doctor. I work here. I'm literally wearing my hospital ID.
Buddy, at this point I don't care. You are coming with me.
Is it because I'm black? That's why you don't care to even check my badge?
Maybe. Go ahead and slowly turn around and put your hands behind your back.
So you're arresting a doctor in his own workplace without confirming
If
anything.
you keep talking, I'll add resistance.
Dr. Marcus Hayes had just saved the life of a 7-year-old child. His hands still trembled slightly from the adrenaline as he walked out of the trauma room, his white lab coat swaying gently as he walked. Underneath, he wore the typical blue hospital shirt that all doctors wore, and his identification badge hanging from the coat swung softly with each step. It was 3 in the morning on a Saturday, and the Memorial Hospital emergency room was at its most chaotic moment. Ambulance sirens echoed from outside, nurses rushed back and forth with medication trays, and the characteristic smell of disinfectant mixed with fear hung heavy in the air. Marcus had worked 12-hour shifts for the past 5 days straight, covering for sick colleagues. But he never complained. Saving lives was all he had ever wanted to do since he was a child growing up in the South Bronx. He stopped in the main emergency room hallway, needing to review some charts before updating the next patient's family. Marcus leaned slightly against the wall, holding a clipboard with medical papers, his eyes quickly scanning test results and nursing notes. He was 34 years old and considered one of the hospital's most talented emergency physicians. His colleagues respected him. His patients adored him. He had a rare ability to remain calm under extreme pressure, to make split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death. On that specific night, he had just stabilized a boy who arrived unconscious after a car accident. Marcus was so absorbed in reading the charts that he didn't immediately notice when a police officer entered the hallway from reception. Sergeant Lisa Brennan had 15 years of service and a reputation for being strict to the point of inflexibility. She had come to the hospital following a suspect from a bar fight who had been brought by ambulance half an hour earlier. Lisa was irritated, tired from a long shift, and had no patience for anything. When she turned the corner and saw Marcus standing in the hallway, something in her mind made a quick calculation. That was completely wrong. To Lisa, the scene didn't make sense the way it should. She saw a black man standing in a hospital hallway at 3 in the morning. She noticed the white lab coat, but somehow her brain didn't process this as evidence that he was a doctor. Maybe she assumed he had stolen the coat. Maybe she simply couldn't conceive that a young black man could be an emergency room physician. Whatever the reason, Lisa immediately decided Marcus was suspicious. She marched up to him with that aggressive confidence some police officers mistake for competence, her hand instinctively resting near her holster. Marcus looked up when he heard the heavy footsteps approaching. He saw the officer coming toward him and initially thought she needed directions or information about a patient. He smiled politely, that professional smile doctors develop to calm people in stressful moments. But what Lisa said next completely wiped the smile off his face. She demanded to know what he was doing there, why he was wandering the hallways, and ordered him to show identification immediately. Her tone wasn't that of someone asking a routine question. It was accusatory, aggressive, as if she had already decided he was doing something wrong. Marcus was confused for a second, processing what was happening. He looked at his own white lab coat, at the badge clearly visible hanging from it with his photo, name, and the title, Dr. Marcus Hayes, M.D., Emergency Medicine printed in large letters. He looked at the clipboard in his hands with official hospital medical forms. Everything about his appearance screamed that he was exactly what he was, a doctor working in his own hospital. But Lisa wasn't looking at any of those things. She was looking at the color of his skin and seeing only what her prejudices allowed her to see. Marcus felt that familiar and terrible sensation in his stomach, that sickening recognition that no matter how many degrees he had or how many lives he saved, to some people, he would always be suspicious first. Marcus calmly pointed to the badge hanging from his coat, his voice maintaining that professional tone he used with difficult patients. He explained he was Dr. Marcus Hayes, emergency physician, and that he was working his regular shift. He showed the clipboard with medical charts, trying to demonstrate the obvious. But Lisa didn't even look properly at the badge. Instead, she took a step closer, her posture becoming more aggressive. She said anyone could grab a lab coat and badge, that she had seen all kinds of fraud in her years of service. She repeated the order for him to show government-issued photo identification, right now. Marcus felt anger beginning to boil beneath the surface of his professional calm. He had spent 8 years in medical school, 4 years of emergency residency, working 36-hour shifts straight, sleeping in closets, studying until his eyes burned. He had accumulated over $200,000 in student debt to get where he was. He had saved hundreds of lives in that exact hallway where he was now being treated like a criminal. But he knew the game. He knew that any wrong move, any wrong tone of voice could escalate the situation in dangerous ways. So he took a deep breath and said his wallet was in the doctor's locker room, but that she could easily verify his identity with any nurse or at reception. Lisa didn't like that answer. She interpreted it as evasion, as someone trying to buy time. Her hand moved closer to the holster, and she said he needed to come with her to reception now, or she would detain him for obstruction. Marcus looked around the hallway, searching for someone who could intervene, any colleague who could confirm who he was. But at that specific moment, the hallway was strangely empty. The nurses were all in rooms with patients. The other doctors were busy with emergencies. It was just him and a police officer who refused to see what was right in front of her. Marcus tried again, his patients wearing thin. He pointed to the nurses' station just 6 meters away, saying Lisa could literally walk there and ask anyone. But Lisa was now committed to her misinterpretation of the situation. She had decided Marcus was suspicious, and admitting she was wrong would mean admitting she had made assumptions based purely on race. Her voice got louder when she ordered him to stop arguing and cooperate. Several patients in the nearby waiting room began looking in their direction, curious about the commotion. That's when a nurse named Jennifer, who had worked with Marcus for 3 years, turned the corner carrying a tray of medical supplies. She saw the scene unfolding and immediately set the tray down on a nearby cart. Jennifer marched up to Lisa with an expression of disbelief and anger on her face. She asked what the hell was happening, why a police officer was harassing Dr. Hayes. Her voice had that sharp tone that emergency room nurses develop after years of dealing with absurd situations. Jennifer was a white woman in her 50s, short but with a presence that demanded respect. Lisa turned to Jennifer, clearly irritated by the interruption. She said she was investigating a suspicious individual in the hospital hallway, and that Jennifer should step back and let her do her job. Jennifer's mouth literally fell open. She looked at Lisa as if the officer had completely lost her sanity. Jennifer pointed directly at Marcus's lab coat, at the badge swinging on his chest, and said loud enough for several people to hear that this man was Dr. Marcus Hayes, one of the best emergency physicians in the hospital, and that he had just come out of surgery saving a child's life. She asked if Lisa was blind or just stupid. The situation should have ended there. Any reasonable person would have backed down, apologized, and admitted the mistake. But Lisa Brennan wasn't known for being reasonable, and she definitely wasn't the type of person who admitted being wrong, especially in front of witnesses. Instead of apologizing, she doubled down. Lisa told Jennifer she didn't take orders from civilians, and that if the nurse didn't back off, she would be charged with obstruction too. Then, in a move that shocked both Marcus and Jennifer, Lisa reached for her belt and grabbed her handcuffs. She ordered Marcus to put his hands behind his back, saying he was being detained until his identity could be properly verified. Marcus couldn't believe what he was hearing. He looked at the handcuffs, then at Lisa's face, searching for some sign that this was some kind of terrible misunderstanding that would be resolved any second. But her eyes were cold, determined, completely convinced of her own authority. Marcus knew he was at a critical moment. If he resisted physically in any way, even if it was just stepping away, Lisa could claim he was resisting arrest. She had a gun. He had seen too many news stories about black men who didn't survive encounters with police for much less. So even though every fiber of his being screamed against the injustice of the moment, Marcus slowly placed the clipboard on the floor. Jennifer practically screamed that Lisa was making a huge mistake, that this was harassment, that she was calling the hospital administrator immediately. She pulled her cell phone from her pocket and started dialing, talking loudly about lawsuits and police misconduct. Other hospital staff began to appear, drawn by the commotion. A lab technician stopped in the hallway, mouth agape. A nurse who was leaving a patient room saw the scene and ran to the nurse's station to grab the phone. Within minutes, half the emergency room knew something absurd was happening in the main hallway. Marcus turned slowly, his hands trembling with anger and humiliation as he placed them behind his back. Lisa approached him from behind, and that's when Dr. Richard Chen, the emergency room medical director and Marcus's direct supervisor, came running down the hallway. Richard was 62 years old, gray-haired, and had a reputation for being calm, even in the most chaotic situations. But when he saw Lisa about to handcuff Marcus, his face turned red with fury. He shouted for Lisa to stop immediately, his voice echoing through the hallway with an authority that made the officer hesitate for a fraction of a second. Richard marched up to them and positioned himself between Lisa and Marcus. He identified himself as the medical director of the emergency department and demanded to know under what authority Lisa was detaining one of his doctors. He pointed to Marcus's lab coat, to the badge, to the medical charts on the floor. Richard said Marcus was a respected physician who had worked there for 5 years, who had saved countless lives, and that unless Lisa had an arrest warrant or actual evidence of a crime, she needed to leave his hospital immediately. His voice was trembling with controlled anger, each word cutting like a scalpel. Lisa finally seemed to realize she had gone too far. She looked around and saw there were now at least a dozen hospital staff members watching, many with phones in their hands, some clearly recording. She saw the expressions of shock and anger on their faces. She heard Jennifer on the phone saying her name and badge number to someone, probably the hospital administrator or a lawyer. Lisa tried to regain some control of the situation. She said she was just following protocol, checking the identity of someone who looked suspicious, but her words sounded weak even to her own ears. Richard wasn't buying any of it. He asked exactly what looked suspicious about a man wearing a white lab coat with a doctor's badge, holding medical charts, standing in the hallway of a hospital where he worked. Lisa had no answer for that. Lisa put the handcuffs back on her belt, trying to make it seem like that had been her intention all along. She mumbled something about just doing her job and ensuring hospital safety, but her words were drowned out by the growing noise of more staff arriving in the hallway. Marcus lowered his hands slowly, his entire body tense with barely contained anger. He looked directly into Lisa's eyes and asked in a low but clear voice if she would have done the same thing to a white doctor, if she would have ignored the lab coat, the badge, the charts, and demanded identification from anyone else. The silence that followed was deafening. Lisa didn't answer because they both knew the answer. Richard told Lisa she needed to leave the hospital immediately or he would call security to escort her out. He also mentioned that the hospital had security cameras in every hallway and that this entire interaction had been recorded. Lisa quickly realized she was on dangerous ground. She tried one last time to recover some authority, saying she was at the hospital investigating a suspect from a separate incident and had every right to be there. Richard cut off that excuse immediately, saying if she had a suspect to investigate, she should go do that instead of harassing medical staff members. He pointed toward the exit and waited. Lisa finally began to retreat, but not before casting one last defiant look at Marcus. She said this wasn't over, that she was going to file a report about the incident. Marcus, who had remained silent during most of the exchange, finally spoke again. He told Lisa she was right about one thing. This definitely wasn't over. He was going to personally ensure that every second of that encounter was documented, reviewed, and that there were appropriate consequences. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise, said with the icy calm of someone who knew exactly how the system worked and had the resources to use it. After Lisa left, the hallway erupted in conversations. Nurses, technicians, and other doctors gathered around Marcus, asking if he was okay, expressing outrage at what they had just witnessed. Jennifer put her hand on his shoulder and said she had everything recorded on her phone, every second since she arrived in the hallway. Other staff members also showed their phones, saying they had filmed different parts of the encounter. Marcus thanked everyone, but his mind was already working on another level. He knew this wasn't just about him, it was about how many other black professionals were treated this way every day, in hospitals, offices, stores, simply for existing in spaces where others didn't expect to see them. Richard took Marcus to his private office, closed the door, and for a moment the two men just stood there in silence. Richard had worked in medicine for 4 decades and had seen a lot, but this genuinely shook him. He asked Marcus what he wanted to do. Marcus didn't hesitate. He wanted to file a formal complaint against Lisa Brennan. He wanted the police department to investigate. He wanted the hospital to make a public statement about the incident, and most importantly, he wanted to sue both Lisa personally and the police department for harassment, false arrest, and civil rights violations. Richard nodded and said the hospital would support Marcus completely, that they would provide all security footage, witness statements, and anything else Marcus's lawyers needed. In the next few hours, while Marcus's shift technically still continued, he could barely concentrate on patients. Other staff members covered his cases, insisting he take time to process what happened. But Marcus was stubborn. He went back to work, seeing patients, saving lives, doing exactly what he should have been doing when he was interrupted and humiliated. Every patient he treated, every life he touched that night, was a silent statement. He wasn't going to let one person's racism define who he was or stop him from doing the work he loved. But inside he was seething, planning, preparing for the battle he knew was coming. The story spread like wildfire through the local medical community before the sun even rose. Memorial Hospital staff shared the incident with colleagues at other hospitals. Cell phone recordings began circulating in private social media groups. By Sunday morning, just hours after the incident, an investigative reporter who had a contact inside the hospital was already calling asking for comments. By Monday morning, the story was on local news with the headline, "Black Doctor Nearly Arrested While Working at Hospital." The staff phone recordings were shared with the media, and although faces were blurred for legal reasons, the audio was crystal clear. Lisa's voice demanding identification, Jennifer screaming that Marcus was a doctor, Richard ordering Lisa to leave. The police department initially tried to downplay the incident. They issued a statement saying Officer Brennan was following standard procedures in verifying the identity of an individual in a hospital during an investigation. But that narrative quickly crumbled when Memorial Hospital released the complete security camera footage. The video showed everything in sharp detail. Marcus standing in the hallway with his white lab coat visible, badge clearly hanging, holding medical charts. Lisa marching up to him and immediately adopting an aggressive posture. Her body language made it obvious she had made instant assumptions based on nothing but Marcus's appearance. Marcus hired Sarah Kowalski, a civil rights attorney known nationally for police misconduct cases. Sarah reviewed all the evidence, the security recordings, the cell phone videos, the witness statements, and told Marcus he had one of the clearest cases she had ever seen. Lisa Brennan had no legal justification to detain Marcus. He wasn't committing a crime. He was literally working at his own workplace, wearing his professional uniform, with visible identification. The only reason for Lisa's approach was racial discrimination, pure and simple. Sarah filed the lawsuit 2 weeks after the incident, seeking $2,400,000 in damages for civil rights violations, emotional suffering, and punitive punishment. The public reaction was immediate and fierce. Civil rights organizations organized protests outside the police station. Black doctors from across the country began sharing their own stories of being mistaken for janitors, security guards, or anything except what they really were. The hashtag #DrWhileBlack began trending on social media, with thousands of medical professionals sharing experiences of discrimination. The pressure on the police department to act became unsustainable. They couldn't just file this away and hope it disappeared. The evidence was too clear. The public outrage was too high. Lisa Brennan was placed on administrative leave while an internal investigation was conducted. But Sarah Kowalski wasn't satisfied with that. She leaked to the press that during her investigation, she had discovered Lisa had a history. 5 previous complaints from citizens alleging discriminatory treatment, all filed away without action. 3 of those complaints were from black men who said they had been stopped without reason, aggressively questioned, treated as suspects when they were simply living their lives. The police department had ignored these warnings and now had a public relations disaster and a federal lawsuit on their hands. Marcus gave a press conference 6 weeks after the incident. He stood in front of cameras from all major news networks, wearing the same white lab coat he wore that night, his doctor's badge clearly visible. He spoke calmly, without apparent anger, but with a conviction that was impossible to ignore. Marcus explained he wasn't doing this for personal revenge. He was doing this because he was a doctor and understood that sometimes you have to treat the disease, not just the symptoms. Systemic racism in law enforcement was the disease. What happened to him was just a symptom. He wanted the lawsuit to create real change, not just an apology and a quiet settlement. Every word he said was carefully chosen, every sentence meant to make clear he wasn't going to back down or be silenced. The case went to trial 8 months after the incident. The courtroom was packed with reporters, civil rights activists, and Marcus's medical colleagues who took the day off to support him. Lisa Brennan sat next to her lawyers provided by the police union, looking 10 years older than on the night of the incident. Her face was pale and tense. She knew the evidence against her was overwhelming, but the union had insisted on going to trial instead of settling, a decision they would soon regret. Sarah Kowalski presented the case methodically, like the legal surgeon she was. She showed the security footage repeatedly, pausing at key moments, Marcus standing calmly with lab coat and badge visible. Lisa completely ignoring these obvious evidences, her aggressive body language, the moment she reached for the handcuffs. The witnesses were devastating for the defense. Jennifer took the stand and described the scene in vivid detail, her voice trembling with contained anger as she explained how she had seen Marcus treated as a criminal simply for existing in his own workplace. Dr. Richard Chen testified about Marcus's impeccable credentials, his 5 years of exemplary service, the dozens of lives he had saved. He also mentioned that in his 40 years of medicine, he had never seen a white doctor approach that way at the hospital. Other hospital staff testified about the trauma they witnessed, how the scene had affected the morale of the entire staff, especially staff of color who now felt less safe in their own work environment. Lisa's lawyers tried to argue she was just being cautious, that hospitals are places where anyone can enter, that she had seen people impersonate medical professionals before. But Sarah easily destroyed these arguments. She asked if Lisa had checked the identity of any white doctors that night. Silence. She asked if Lisa really believed someone would steal a lab coat, forge a photo badge, memorize enough medical terminology to carry convincing charts, all just to stand in a hospital hallway at 3 a.m. The logic was absurd. Sarah then presented the 5 previous complaints against Lisa, establishing a clear pattern of racial discrimination. The most powerful moment of the trial came when Marcus testified. He didn't cry. He didn't shout. He simply told his story with the same clinical clarity he used when describing medical cases. He talked about working double shifts, about being exhausted after saving a child's life, about looking at that hallway where he had saved hundreds of patients and feeling completely powerless. He described the humiliation of having to prove his own existence, his own profession, to someone who refused to see what was right in front of her. Marcus looked directly at the jury and said the most painful part wasn't the near arrest. It was realizing that no matter how many degrees he had, how many lives he saved, or how hard he worked, to some people, he would always be suspicious first and human second. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. They returned with a unanimous verdict in favor of Marcus on all charges: civil rights violations, false arrest, emotional suffering. And then came the part that made national headlines. The jury awarded Marcus exactly the $2,400,000 he had requested, but also added additional punitive damages of $800,000 against Lisa personally and the police department. The total of $3,200,000 was one of the largest civil rights verdicts in the state that year. The courtroom erupted in applause. Lisa put her face in her hands. Marcus remained seated calmly, nodding once, satisfied that justice had been served. The aftermath was swift and sweeping. Lisa Brennan was fired from the police department 3 days after the verdict. Her police certification was permanently revoked, which meant she could never work in law enforcement again anywhere in the country. The police department was forced to implement radical changes in training. Every officer now had to go through 60 hours of annual implicit bias training, not the 15-minute videos they used to use. They created a civilian oversight panel with real power to investigate complaints. All stops and detentions now had to be documented with clear justification. The police chief, under immense pressure, eventually resigned 6 months later. Marcus used part of the settlement money to establish a foundation called Seen and Heard, dedicated to supporting black professionals who faced discrimination in their workplaces. The foundation provided legal assistance, counseling, and created racial bias training programs for hospitals and companies. Marcus became a national voice on racism in medicine, giving lectures at medical conferences, writing articles, appearing on news programs. He never stopped working as an emergency physician at Memorial Hospital. That hallway where he was humiliated became a daily reminder of why his advocacy work mattered. Every life he saved, there was a silent statement that he belonged in that space, always belonged, and no amount of prejudice could change that. Lisa Brennan disappeared from public life after losing her job. Rumors said she had moved to another state, that she was working in private security under a different name. Some felt sorry for her, arguing her life had been ruined by a mistake. But Marcus, when asked about it in interviews, always responded the same way. It wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. Lisa chose to see his skin before seeing his lab coat, chose to ignore obvious evidence because it didn't fit her prejudiced assumptions, chose to escalate the situation even when multiple people tried to correct her. These were choices, and choices have consequences. The case Marcus Hayes versus Lisa Brennan and police department became study material in law schools, police academies, and diversity training programs across the country. The security footage from that night was watched millions of times, analyzed frame by frame, used as a perfect example of how implicit bias manifests in real actions with real consequences. And Marcus continued his work, saving lives, fighting for justice, proving every day that he belonged exactly where he was. Because in the end, it wasn't about one racist officer or a multi-million-dollar lawsuit. It was about dignity, about being seen as human first, and about ensuring the next generation of black doctors never had to prove their existence just to do the work they loved.